You wake up and reach for a tool before your eyes are even open. Your hand finds the phone. Inside that one slab of glass and metal sits a flashlight, a map, a calendar, a camera, a library, and 100 other tools folded into a single rectangle. You do not think of it as a tool. It is just there. It is just part of you. Now imagine handing that phone to someone who lived 30,000 years ago. They would have no idea what it was for. But here is the stranger thought. Hand their tools to you, and you might be just as lost. For most of the human story, a tool was not bought. It was made. With your own hands, out of stone and bone and hide and plant and fire. And some of those everyday objects were so odd, so unexpected, that if one were placed in your palm right now, you could not guess what it was for. This is the world of the strangest tools your ancestors used every single day. Start with the oldest one, older than you might think possible. In 2015, an archaeologist named Sonia Harmand and her team announced something that quietly broke the timeline of human invention. At a site called Lomekwi 3, on the western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya, they found stone tools that were 3.3 million years old. Sit with that number for a moment. That is not just older than your species, it is older than your entire genus. The first members of Homo, the group that includes you, did not appear until hundreds of thousands of years later, which means something that was not yet human was already picking up rocks, striking them against each other and shaping the world on purpose. The tools themselves look like nothing. To your eye, they are just broken stones. Lumpy, heavy, unremarkable. You would walk past them on a riverbank without a second glance. But that is exactly the point. The first tools did not look like tools. They looked like the world. The genius was invisible. What those early makers had figured out is a trick called napping. Napping just means striking one stone against another at the right angle to flake off a sharp edge. Strike too softly and nothing happens. Strike too hard, in the wrong place, and the whole thing shatters. The skill is in the angle, the force, and the choice of stone. It looks simple, it is not. Move forward in time and the tools get sharper, and so does the mind behind them. Roughly 2.5 million years ago, in a place that would later be called Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, your ancestors were producing a whole kit of stone flakes and cores. Archaeologists named this the Olduvai toolkit, after the gorge itself. It was studied for decades by Leakey, one of the most important figures in the history of this field, who spent much of her life on her hands and knees in that hot, dry valley, brushing dirt off the oldest evidence of human craft on Earth. The Olduvai flake does not look like much either, but run a sharp stone flake along a piece of hide, and suddenly you can do things your body alone could never do. You can cut meat from bone. You can crack open a leg bone to reach the rich marrow inside. You can scrape, slice, and butcher. A creature with no claws and small teeth had just borrowed the edge of the planet and made it part of itself. Then comes the first tool that looks to modernize almost beautiful. Around 1.5 million years ago, a new shape appears across Africa, then Europe, then Asia. It is called the Acheulean handaxe, named after a town in France called Saint-Acheulean, where these objects were first studied. And it is strange for reasons that have puzzled experts for over a century. Picture a teardrop of stone, the size of your hand, symmetrical. Both faces flaked smooth, pointed at one end, rounded at the other. It fits the palm like it was designed by someone who cared not just whether it worked, but how it felt and how it looked. Here is the first oddity. Your ancestors made this same shape with only small variations for over 1 million years. Think about that span. The handaxe was in continuous use for longer than your species has existed many times over. No phone, no car, no piece of clothing you own will last a fraction of that. This single design outlived empires that had not even been imagined yet because it worked, and because it was passed from hand to hand, parent to child, for tens of thousands of generations. But there is a second oddity, and this is where it gets genuinely weird. Some handaxes are too perfect. Archaeologists keep finding handaxes that are flawlessly symmetrical, beautifully finished, and almost never used. Some are too large to grip comfortably. Some are made from stone so fragile or so beautiful that using them to butcher an animal would be foolish. So what were they for? In 1999, 2 researchers named Marek, Kohn, and Mithen put forward an idea that sounds almost funny until you think about it. What if some of these handaxes were not tools at all, in the way you mean the word? What if they were a kind of display? A way of saying, look what I can make. Look how steady my hands are, how good my eye is, how much patience I have. In a world with no resumes and no possessions, a perfect handaxe might have been a living advertisement of skill and fitness. You cannot prove what was in the mind of someone a million years gone, but the pattern is real. Some of these objects were made to be seen, not used, which means the strangest thing about the oldest tools may be that they were never only about survival. They were also about being noticed. Hold that thought. It comes back at the end. Now let your ancestors get clever in a different way. Because the next strange tool is not a thing at all. It is a recipe. Imagine you need to attach a sharp stone point to a wooden shaft to make a spear. You have no string strong enough, no nails, no glue. What do? Your ancestors solved this with one of the first manufactured substances in history, birch tar. Birch tar is a sticky black glue made by heating the bark of a birch tree. And here is why it is so strange. You cannot make it by accident. Birch bark will not turn to tar if you simply throw it in a fire. It burns. To make tar, you have to heat the bark in a low oxygen environment at a fairly precise temperature for a sustained period, often by burying it or sealing it away from the open flame. That is chemistry, real controlled chemistry performed by people with no words for any of it. The truly remarkable part is who was doing this. Some of the oldest birch tar comes from Neanderthals, your close evolutionary cousins, made well over 100,000 years ago, long before any modern human reached Europe. For a long time, people imagined Neanderthals as slow and simple. The tar says otherwise. To make it, you must plan ahead. Control a process you cannot see happening, and remember a sequence of steps with no second chances if you get the heat wrong. And once you have your tar, you do something even stranger with it. You chew it. Lumps of ancient birch tar have been found marked with tooth impressions. People softened it in their mouths to make it workable, the way you might soften a piece of candy. Some of those lumps are so well preserved that scientists have pulled human DNA straight out of the chewed surface, and even traces of what the chewer had recently eaten. A piece of prehistoric chewing gum, thousands of years old, still carrying the fingerprint of a single human being who is otherwise lost to time. You chew gum to pass the time. Your ancestors chewed glue to hold their entire toolkit together. Now travel to the southern tip of Africa, to a cave on a cliff above the sea. This is Blombos Cave, and what was found inside it changes how you should think about the word tool entirely. The work at Blombos is led by an archaeologist named Christopher Henshilwood, and one of the most famous discoveries there is roughly 100,000 years old. It is a paint factory. Inside the cave, your ancestors had set up what can only be called a workshop for processing ochre. Ochre is a natural earth pigment, a soft rock rich in iron that produces a deep red color when ground down. At Blombos, people were grinding ochre into powder, mixing it with bone marrow fat and charcoal and a little liquid, and storing the finished paint inside containers made from abalone shells. Beside the shells lay the grinding stones and the bone tools used to stir and transfer the mixture. Stop and picture the strangeness of this. 100,000 years ago, in a cave, someone had a dedicated set of tools whose only purpose was to make color. Not to cut, not to hunt, not to stay alive in any direct way, to make red. Why does that matter? Because making paint means you wanted to mark something. A body, a skin, a stone, a meaning. The toolkit at Blombos is not a survival kit. It is the toolkit of a mind that had begun to think in symbols. And that may be one of the most important strange tools your ancestors ever built, because it points to the moment the human imagination switched on. Henshilwood's team also found, in the same cave, a small piece of ochre deliberately scratched with a cross-hatched pattern. A design, made for no practical reason at all. Some of the oldest evidence anywhere on Earth of a human being making a mark simply because they wanted to. So far you have stone, glue, and paint. Now add something so small you would never expect it to survive at all. The needle. Deep in a place called Denisova Cave in Siberia, in a region so cold and so old that it has reshaped the whole story of human origins, archaeologists found a sewing needle made of bone. It is roughly 50,000 years old. It has a carefully drilled eye at one end, just like the needle in any sewing kit today. It is thin, polished, and almost delicate. Think about what that needle means. To survive a Siberian winter, you do not just need fire. You need clothing that actually seals out the cold, tailored clothing, layered, fitted, sewn tight at the seams. The eyed needle is the tool that made true cold weather clothing possible, and without it, vast stretches of the planet would have stayed closed to your ancestors forever. A spear lets you face an animal. A needle lets you face a continent. And the strangeness keeps coming because there is one tool your ancestors carried that you carry too, in almost the same form. And you have probably used it this week without thinking. The toothpick. When scientists examine very old teeth, including the teeth of human ancestors going back more than 1 million years, they sometimes find small, smooth grooves worn into the sides, right at the gum line. Those grooves are not natural. They are the mark left by something narrow being pushed between the teeth over and over for years. Your ancestors were poking at their gums with little sticks or splinters of bone long before they could write, build, or farm. The toothpick may be one of the oldest tools that has never gone out of style. Now here is a tool you would almost certainly fail to recognize. You would pick it up, turn it over, and put it back down, with no idea that you were holding one of the deadliest inventions of the ancient world. It is called a spear thrower, sometimes known by the older name atlatl. And to your eye, it is just a flat stick, a little longer than your forearm, with a small hook or cup carved at one end. That is it. That is the whole tool. So what makes it so important? The hook holds the back end of a light spear, called a dart. When you throw, the stick becomes an extension of your arm, a second elbow, a lever that whips the dart forward with far more speed and force than your muscles could ever produce alone. A trained thrower could send a dart across a distance that a hand-thrown spear would never reach, and drive it home hard enough to bring down large game. Think about what that meant. With this strange flat stick, a person who weighed 150 pounds could strike from a safe distance, instead of closing in and risking everything. The spear thrower did not just help your ancestors hunt, it kept them alive while they did it, and you would never guess any of that from the object itself. The danger was hidden in the physics, invisible until the moment of the throw. Which brings us to the one ancient toolkit you do not have to imagine, because it was found whole, on the body of a man who carried it to his death. In 1991, 2 hikers in the Alps, on the border between Italy and Austria, came across a body frozen in the ice. At first it was treated as a recent death. It was not. The man had died roughly 5,300 years ago, and the ice had kept him, and everything he carried, almost perfectly preserved. He is now known as Ötzi, named for the Ötztal Valley where he was found. Ötzi is the closest you will ever come to looking inside a real prehistoric pocket. He was not empty-handed. He carried a copper axe with a blade of almost pure copper, a genuinely valuable and advanced object for his time. He had a flint dagger with a woven grass sheath. He carried a fire-starting kit that included pieces of a fungus called true tinder fungus, chosen because it catches a spark and holds an ember. He had 2 containers made of birch bark, likely used to carry live coals from one camp to the next, so that fire itself could travel with him. And he carried something stranger still. Threaded onto a leather strap were lumps of another fungus, a type of birch fungus that has natural antibacterial properties. Ötzi's gut, when examined, turned out to be carrying parasites. So one careful reading of the evidence is that he was carrying his own medicine, a small pharmacy hanging from a cord, 5,000 years before a pharmacy existed. Every single item on him he understood. The axe, the fire kit, the medicine, the sheath. There was nothing in his possession that he could not have explained, repaired, or, given time, made again from scratch. Now bring all of this together into a single life. Because tools are not a museum case, they were a day. Picture one of your ancestors late in the Stone Age. You can think of this person as you, dropped into a body that knows things your body has forgotten. You wake before dawn, beside the warm ash of last night's fire. Your hands already know the cold. The first thing you reach for is a stone flake, kept close because a sharp edge is the difference between eating and not. You check your spear. The point is bound to the shaft with birch tar you heated and chewed soft yourself, and the bind is still tight. Good. You pull on clothing that was sewn, not bought. The seams were stitched with a bone needle and sinew thread, fitted to your shape, because a loose seam in winter can cost you everything. Your skin still carries a faint trace of red ochre from a marking made days ago, a sign that means something to your people, even if it would mean nothing to a stranger. You eat, you scrape a hide, you repair a handle, you teach a younger member of the group the angle of the strike, the same angle your ancestors learned 1 million years before. And tucked somewhere safe, maybe, is a single beautiful handaxe you made not to use but to keep, because it is the finest thing your hands have ever produced. Every object around you, you understand completely. You know where the stone came from, how the glue was made, why the needle is shaped the way it is. There is not a single tool in your world whose inner workings are a mystery to you. And that brings us to the twist, the part that turns this whole story around. You probably assumed that the strangest thing about ancient tools is how primitive they were. It is the opposite. The strangest thing about your ancestors' tools is how much knowledge each one hid. A handaxe is not a rock. It is a million years of inherited technique, balance, and judgment compressed into one shape. Birch tar is not glue, it is chemistry performed without a single written instruction. By people who passed the method down through memory alone, generation after generation, never once getting it wrong long enough for the knowledge to die. The needle, the ochre, the spear point, the toothpick, each one is a tiny library of understanding, carried not in books but in hands and minds. Your ancestors did not have many tools, but they understood every one of them, all the way down. Now look back at the thing in your pocket. You hold more raw power in your phone than every tool in this entire story combined. But could you make it? Could you mine the metals, refine the glass, write the code, build the chip? Could you even explain in detail how the screen turns your touch into light? Almost certainly not, and neither could the person next to you. This is the quiet trade your species made. Your ancestors owned a handful of tools and knew them completely. You own thousands of tools and understand almost none of them. They carried the whole of their technology in their own two hands and their own memory. You carry far more, but you carry it on trust, leaning on a vast invisible chain of strangers you will never meet. And remember the handaxe that was too perfect to use, the one made to be seen, to say, look what I can make, look how skilled I am. You still do that. The phone in your hand is not just a tool, it is also a statement. The newest model, the cleanest case, the right brand held just so. A million years later, you are still making beautiful objects partly to be noticed. That impulse did not arrive with technology. It was already there, flaked into stone, before your species even had a name. So tomorrow, when you wake and reach for a tool before your eyes are even open, hold it for 1 extra second. It is the strangest tool in human history. Not because it is crude, but because it is the only one your ancestors would find truly impossible to understand. And if you are honest, so would you.